Dear beloved, welcome back. Today we have our very first guest, Sarah. Welcome, Sarah.
Hello.
I'm so happy to have her on today. And today we're going to talk about what we are made for, what this looks like as women specifically, but also just what we're made for as humans in general. So before we jump into that, I want to just ask our guest here, Sarah, what she's grateful for this week or today.
Oh my goodness, there's so much I could be grateful for. It's always a hard one to nail down. I'll limit it down. Today, I am grateful for a body that moves, which sounds really weird, but I often find myself in the mornings realizing how much I'm grateful to be autonomous in my own physical abilities. And so waking up this morning, I just had that thought again, which I don't know where it comes from, but I'm just grateful that that I can do all the things I need to do during the day, that my body allows me to do so, that God created it as such. Because I know there are a lot of people who don't have that freedom and ability in this world. And so I like to make sure I recognize that. And as a result, of course, take care of my body in the same way as I'm grateful for it.
Amen. I love it. So great. So great. So diving into our topic a little bit, I want to start off with kind of going broad and then going more narrow. So when we talk about relationships, like we're going to be talking about on this podcast, we need to first know where we're coming from and to where we're going, because that kind of helps us understand relationships as they pertain to us and then how to act in them, right? Because if, like, a lot of ways, like if we don't have an end point, it can be kind of hard to know, like, how to get there. If that makes sense.
Right.
Definitely.
Right.
So I think I'd love to just discuss kind of like that broad picture, like what, where do we come from and to where we're going, that kind of idea.
Yeah. So the where we come from being that we come from God, we come from, we are made by Him, made in the womb of our mothers, perfectly and wonderfully, by the Lord. It's in conjunction with two, a man and a woman and the Lord that person is being made. We don't need to get into nitty gritty of that kind of thing, but then we all know what that means. And then we go, we then are in this world, we live our lives for the glory of God. And the ending we are then going back to the Lord. And from dust and to dust we shall return, and that we return to the Lord in heaven ideally, knowing that there's always potential for there's purgatory too, which we can go into. We won't talk about that right now, but the simplicity of it, going from the Lord and back to the Lord in heaven.
Right. And that is beautiful, but that's not really like, it's not as kind of bleak and as dry as that, I think, because sometimes people can be like, oh my gosh, that's boring. Like, are we not supposed to do anything else? And no, that's not true.
Seems basic.
Like, we do need to know, like, from where we come from and to where we're going to see the big picture. But then, like, I mean, with any story, the fun stuff comes in the middle, right?
Right.
So we know that we're made for, like, as human beings on this earth, we're made for, we're made for a relationship, and we're made for all of these things that help us to get back to God, but also help to, kind of purify us in this life. Like you mentioned, purgatory, like we're not perfect. And so there are things that we need to learn and things that we need to do in order to live rightly in the eyes of God. And if we don't do that, then we have to make reparation, we have to grow. And again, we digress.
Yes. Yeah. We could go so far down.
But that's part of it, right? And so this in between is where the Lord allows us to make mistakes, and He allows us to correct our mistakes, and He allows us to choose Him, and He wants us to choose Him in everything, right? So that's like a piece of what we're made for, but there's so many things we can talk about when it comes to like what we're made for. So let's start off by talking about, very clearly we're made for a relationship, and like there's so many different kinds of relationship in the world. So yeah, I mean, that's what we're made for.
Yeah. And that's it, even that sometimes I know people will consider to be a little bit almost too simplified of an answer, because it's like, well, duh. Like, like well, what else are we doing if not, constantly in relationship with others? But we've all experienced, I'm sure, that it doesn't always look the way it should. We're not perfect within our relationships either. Like relationships, they fluctuate. There's a lot of different kinds. Some of us are better at certain ones than others. And as women, we're first daughter and sister and friend, wife, mother, grandmother. God willing that that's the path that we end up on. Not everyone will. Um, but being in relationship is definitely something that God has ordained as good
Mhm.
and beautiful. And we as humans, and especially as women, who I think if if you talk to anyone, I feel like a lot of people will say that if you're going to choose either men or women to be the ones that are like really good at relationship, it's going to be women.
Yeah.
Um, in our own, I mean, men have their own in their own unique way, but women especially, we tend to be the ones that prioritize relationship within our lives in a way that's different from men. And so we see it, and we see it differently. We have different priorities
Mhm.
within them. So that's particularly important as well. And you can dive deeper into each of the different relationships that we do prioritize and that we
Yeah.
do.
Oh, exactly. And speaking of different relationships, John Paul II has this great, and I don't know if like he's the original thinker on this. I mean, it's just very true. He gets it
Yes.
from Genesis in the scriptures, but he said that
Yes.
there's four relationships of man, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's first and foremost between man and God, right? He was
Mm-hmm.
created, so this gift has been given, transferred
Mm-hmm.
to man, and that relationship is born then. And it
Mm-hmm.
can take many different turns. It can be good and steady, or it can be wayward, or come back,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, right? So our relationship with God is fundamental to us. There's
Mm-hmm.
also a relationship between man and himself, right? And that's a
Mm-hmm.
relationship that I think it's funny because I I kind of am like sometimes people forget about it, but also some people are like way too focused on it, right?
Right. There's always an extreme,
Right.
one
There's
way
a
or the
lot of
other.
extremes
Rarely a
happening with
balance.
that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. But obviously there can be, there's a right way to kind of have that relationship. And then there's man in relation to other men, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
where we think of normally relationship, right? We have friendships and we have mothers and fathers and we
Mm-hmm.
have, spouses and those things. And those are things are really important and they are
Mm-hmm.
what life is made of, right? Um, and
Mm-hmm.
then the last relationship of man, which I don't think like before I read this, I was like, really? I never would have thought of it, but it's man in
Yeah.
relation to the earth. And that we,
Mm-hmm.
in creation, man, Adam, was given dominion over the earth to till it and to
Mm-hmm.
tend it and to, make that happen. And so we have a responsibility towards our relationship with the earth. And I'm not saying
Mm-hmm.
like, let's go be tree huggers or anything, but like,
Right. Right.
um, we have to
I
have
think in the
some,
same way we tend to be extremes in that sense too, is the
exactly.
people who are particularly huge on the environment and others who just think, oh, it doesn't matter. Like if we're going to die anyway, they're going to die anyway.
Yeah.
And there's again not always a good balance in that relationship either.
Totally, totally. And I think that could be said for any of these relationships, really. There can be
Mm-hmm.
extremes. Um, but yeah, again, like I said, it's just so important to recognize that
Mm-hmm.
these are fundamental to who we are, that these four relationships
Right.
are at the heart of humanity and at the heart of who
Mm-hmm.
we are. And if one or more of them are lacking, or like we said, at an
Mm-hmm.
extreme, the other ones can suffer, right? I mean, I'm
Right.
sure you've
Right.
known like you're not praying as much and your relationships are suffering, or whatever it may
Mm-hmm.
be,
Mm-hmm.
they all affect each other.
Well, and also recognizing that there is a proper order because we
Yes.
can't be the reason why we're made for a relationship is because we were in relationship with God
Hmm.
first, and that in that creation, in Him creating us as man and
Hmm.
woman, and then going off of that is it's not just that there are four; it's that there are four in
Yeah.
order, and without that being rightly ordered, that's what kind of throws us out of whack, and and can force us to realize where we are lacking and then see where the extremes are, but how that's not ordered properly. Because it's not just that there are extremes and everything, that each one individual needs to be balanced, it's that they need to balance with each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of people also find that they're not really understanding why things might be going wrong,
Yeah.
or why they're having so many problems either within their relationships or just in life in general, is if things aren't rightly ordered, that it's just going to naturally kind of start falling apart, or at least not be using it to its fullest extent, or it's to its most fruitful outcomes.
Yeah. No, totally. I totally agree. And another thing you touched on with being like relationships specifically to women is that it's going to look different. I mean, men and women are
Mm-hmm.
different, and
Mm-hmm.
we are much more emotional in our thinking and processing. We
Mm-hmm.
could have people who aren't very emotional in their communication, right? Of course, like I will say that's
Mm-hmm.
me, but like I'm emotional in other ways. Like emotion
Mm-hmm.
has as part of being a woman and how it like
Mm-hmm.
motivates us, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
that can, really it's a blessing in relationships because there needs to be that nurturing, and there needs to be that,
Mm-hmm.
wanting to go deeper, and that like desire to
Mm-hmm.
dive into things that are like mean something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where men's tendency isn't to do that. And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
a really beautiful way that we work in complementarity with each other,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
also a way that we're different, right? So,
Right. Right. I think we hear often that men are the best at like compartmentalizing, and whereas women are best at seeing a whole picture. Particularly when it comes to relationships, especially, I'm sure in other areas of life as well, but for the sake of this conversation, definitely within relationships
yeah.
as well. So men, they'll deal with whatever they're dealing with in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
They don't really think about what else is going on, and they'll take care of it. And that's something that is needed and valued, because we can, I mean, like, I don't want to get too like stereotypical, but we as women can tend to be a little overly emotional
Mm-hmm.
sometimes. And I don't mean in the sense of like hysterical. I mean more in the sense of like where we place our significance and importance within our relationships can sometimes go over the top.
Mm-hmm.
But both those things balanced is what is needed. And so we need the men's kind of compartmentalization, seeing things for what they are, a little bit more black and white mentality, in order to balance our sense of or our need to really dig deep,
Yeah.
maybe in ways that we don't always have to, but in a way that's still so beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we need both those things. So we can go on and on about how we complement each other in those ways.
Yeah.
Like we could be having a whole conversation just about that.
That was so true.
But, but yeah, but that's just one of the ways, many in which too, we're in complementing each other, that within relationships that finds its balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And like you said, there's so many things we talk about with complementarity, but
Mm-hmm.
one that I think is incredible in the eyes of the creator, right? That he made
Mm-hmm.
this to be, right. Women are the crown of creation, right? God
Mm-hmm.
made a lot of beautiful things in the world, a lot of beautiful things. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
imagine looking at a beautiful mountain or a lake, whatever it may be. God made some beautiful creation, and he wants beauty to be in the world because he wants us to experience beauty. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that that's, sometimes lost, especially when we get so caught up in like all the bad things in the world, right? That
Mm-hmm.
God wants us to see beauty. And
Mm-hmm.
beauty is something that specifically women, I mean definitely men too, but specifically women are really drawn to. And not only
Mm-hmm.
drawn to like, oh my gosh, that's beautiful, I'm drawn to it, but more so drawn to cultivate it.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Being
Yeah.
the fairer sex, that helps, but also like they recognize the importance of beauty, and they make their homes beautiful, and tend gardens and things like that that just really bring beauty out into the
Mm-hmm.
world. And like we were just mentioning with complementarity, I mean it complements so many things in men,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Well, we cultivate it. We want to mimic it. Like we
Hmm.
see the beauty. Like we. I'm sure there's a quote about this somewhere. Of course, I didn't pull it out, but there's something to say about how we're in Scripture, God uses terms of beauty, um, varying terms of beauty to describe women, but all
Hmm.
and how Jesus also treats women in his circles in his life, all pointing toward the goal of, or not the goal, I'm sorry, the meaning of beauty within life. I mean, it's all
Yeah.
surrounded within his circle of women, but even in the early scripture where different terms of beauty are what is used to describe women. And so not it's almost exclusively to women. I mean, yes, men are beautiful as well in their own way, but it's just proving more and more
Hmm.
how we as women are not only meant to we are the beauty of creation.
Hmm.
Um and so it is literally built within us to desire that
Yeah.
and to want to, like you said, to cultivate it, to mimic it,
Hmm.
to like be drawn to it, to and that doesn't mean, that's not to say that there aren't different kinds. I mean, we all still have our own taste and we have our unique
Yeah.
desires, and
Yeah.
like that's all there. But because beauty can be defined in so many ways as well, like I mean, as we've seen, but we have that innate desire that's literally built into who we are, um, the way that God made
Hmm.
us to desire that, in a way that's completely unique unto us.
I agree. And it's funny because we as women cultivate beauty, but we also have this gift, I will say, to draw beauty out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody
Mm-hmm.
may see like dead flowers and they're like, oh, like we're going to take out the
Done
dead
with.
ones and have like, oh,
Yeah.
and then have the, or like, oh, let's dry the flowers and create it beautiful again. Like just drawing out the beauty. And in a
Mm-hmm.
special way, we do that in our relationships too.
I was literally gonna go there. I was like, there's beauty comes out of multiple. Yep,
Yeah,
keep going.
like imagine like I mean a mother and
Hmm.
her nurturing is beautiful, but also in that she's able to draw out beauty in each of her children. And
Hmm.
that's like it's an incredible gift. And
Hmm.
if she's not doing it, then who is, right?
Right, right,
So,
right. Exactly.
yeah. Beauty is like it's not only aesthetic, right? I think
Oh yeah.
sometimes we can just be like, oh, what's the point of beauty? Beauty is just beauty and that's it,
Hmm.
right? No, like it points to something greater. It points to
Hmm.
something greater, right? Isn't it one of the
Beauty
the
points to the truth of what
transcendentals
something is. Hmm.
of like truth, beauty, and goodness? Like those three
Hmm.
point us back to God and point us back to, well, there's something so beautiful here on this earth. There's got to be a creator who designed it. Like, and we
Hmm.
see that
Hmm.
in women. I mean, I see
Exactly.
that in all humans.
Yeah.
And being a
Yeah.
woman, I see that in
There's an
man.
inherent.
But
Yeah.
I can only,
Yes, there's an inherence of that within all of us.
yes,
But yeah.
yeah. But I can only imagine how, like, say, men would view women and be like, wow, like, there must be a creator. Because I see that, like, I look at you and I'm like, there must be a creator who designed you because,
Right,
like,
right.
that doesn't just happen,
Hmm.
right? and
Hmm.
and beauty really points us back to God. And I think that's, I mean, obviously it's not the only function of beauty, but
No.
it's a huge one.
But that's the beauty of beauty too.
Yeah.
It's like it's there, which that sounds really silly now that I say it out loud. But you get what I'm saying is that there's so many facets, there's
Hmm.
so much depth, there's so much um, complexity to just the definition of beauty alone.
Yeah.
That imagine how with how beauty is being um, displayed and utilized throughout the world in so many different ways.
Hmm.
Because beauty is applied to so many different things. You can use the word
Hmm.
beauty or beautiful in describing so many things, and that in and of itself kind of, I don't like it that's what reflects in a way
Hmm.
how God created the world, created us,
Yeah.
um, in its ability to be applied in so many different areas,
Hmm.
and within so many different people, because we all look different. We all
Yeah.
look so different.
Yeah.
Um, but then even beauty isn't necessarily, when we're saying that we're beautiful, we're not even talking about so much our physical appearance. We're talking about what's within us. And also because the Holy Spirit resides within us, there's nothing that can be beautiful, that it's in a way it can't be beautiful.
Right.
So it's like that when you can just keep going with this trail of like,
Yeah.
you can keep going and going and going.
Definitely.
But I love that. That's just what, it's so invigorating, and it just reminds you of like, that's when we're talking about what we're made for, both as humans, but specifically as women. I mean, once you get into that mindset, it's so hard to then go back to life and think and not live it in a way that is reflecting of that beauty.
Yeah,
Like,
and
you can't just
honoring it.
pretend. Exactly. It's like, you
Yeah.
can't just go to live normal life, especially after having, whether you're talking about it with someone else, whether you recognize it in someone else, read it in a book. Like, it's like when you get slapped with the truth of something, you really realize like, oh, like, I can't just go back to living the way
Yeah.
I was now. Like,
Yeah.
I have to like live in a way that's honoring and respecting and displaying of that truth, which is inherently what beauty is meant to do. It's meant to reveal the truth of who God is. And so if we're made for that, if we're made to reflect that, within ourselves, but also within our relationships, within the way we treat others, like, how incredible is that? How lucky are we? Like,
Yeah.
how blessed are we?
No, seriously. And it's also important to like recognize that like beauty and I think it's helpful to see beauty in terms of relationships too, because we then know it's not for us alone.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not something that's selfish, and neither is our humanity. Like, yes, we
Right.
have a relationship with ourselves, but our humanity, the gift of our lives, is not solely for us. It's also a gift which only retains its giftedness, its being, if it's being given to others.
Exactly.
Right? And we can see that in a spousal relationship most clearly. But you can also see it in every other relationship. And you can see that through like service and like serving others. Like, I mean, it ties all of these things together, but in the Last Supper, when Jesus is washing the
Washing the
disciples'
feet.
feet, and like, I don't know, like what anyone's first, experience with that is, or, sometimes you just see it through a new light. But sometimes I can just sit there and like read it or listen to that and just be like struck and just be like, that is so beautiful. And it's not because he's making himself less than he is, but he's fulfilling who he is. And
Right.
and that happens to be through service, and that means we're made to do that too. And so it's not like, oh, we're being like, we can't think for ourselves, or someone told us to do something, but rather
Right.
it's a living out of who we are.
Right. Because service has been so construed to mean something totally different in our society, like what it means to be a servant, or to serve others, has largely changed. Like, the definition of that has largely changed as society has gone on. Or in the opposite way, like, Jesus changed the definition at when he came, and he changed what it meant, and now it's kind of reverted back to maybe what it meant before Jesus came, where he's not making himself a servant in the conventional sense of the word,
Right.
But he's displaying what it means as a king of heaven, king of the world, what a king is meant to be doing. And I think that's what people forget too, is like, a king is, while they are, yes, dominion over whatever, it also is, they're serving their people. And that often gets lost in both in history and in our understanding of what it means to be a royalty, and so Jesus has reminded us of what it means to be a king, to be a leader, and that they are just as humble and meek as the rest of us. They just happen to have been given this gift of ruling. Now, obviously, Jesus doesn't just happen to give that. That's not what I meant. But when it comes to Jesus was divine in the sense that he is meant to be in that role. But Um, but that then puts it on us as humans, realizing like, well, we're not kings and queens in the normal sense
Mhm.
of the word, but we have been given a sense of dominion over our own lives,
Mhm.
and those that we come in contact with, how we treat others. And so, of course, service has to be such a big part of that, giving of ourselves,
Mhm.
sacrificing of ourselves, um, with Jesus in mind, not only in the sense of foot washing and the way that he displayed
Mhm.
it, but also in his sacrifice on the cross. Like we are always going to be, um, we always have to have that at the forefront when it comes to, if we're made for relationship, um, first and foremost with the Lord, and then with ourselves, and then with others. I feel like that the balance that has to come with then giving of ourselves as well, because
Yeah.
I can't see how it can go any other way. Like you can't, everyone says too, like a relationship is a two-way street, or it's,
Mhm.
there's two people involved, or there's two something. It has to be, relationship by definition means that one, there's something on either end, right?
Mhm.
And so you can't have that relationship without giving of yourself in some way.
Right.
And otherwise, the relationship will dissipate. It'll disappear,
Right.
if you're not giving of yourself in some way. Now that can then be taken even further, but I'm sure you can continue with that and say like, but then here are ways in which
Yeah.
service can even go further than that.
Well, there's so many. I mean, we could talk forever about like 7 topics that stem off of
Yes,
that.
yes.
Like, all of the things.
Which I think is
But
the moral of the story of this entire conversation. We could go on for so many different
yes,
different
yes,
ways.
this is just the
Yeah,
beginning.
great.
But I just want to say like one more thing on the topic of service and
Yes.
of like giving of ourselves. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of ways that men and women are called to do that in the same way. But there's
Hmm.
also a few ways where we're called to do it in different ways.
Yes.
Right. And I think that, submission, like you were saying, is misconstrued in our culture. And just side note, isn't it funny that like the things that we are called to and that are true, good, and beautiful are always construed in our culture? Like, let me
Oh
just
yeah.
say, like,
The devil does some good work in that, good in the sense of
he
effective.
was doing his job. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. On side note. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, going back to like men and women and service and like how that can look different. Like we look
Hmm.
back to, um, you know, women give of their body to
Hmm.
bear children, right?
Hmm.
And that's like really beautiful. And it's also like giving a lot of themselves, right?
Right. Right.
And it's not that men aren't called to give of their body, right? Like in Ephesians 5, when they're saying, men love your wives like Christ loved the church and died. Like
Yeah. Die to
there
yourself.
does
Yeah.
come like death of the body as well, of
Hmm.
like whether it be, providing for the family, working a job that like makes you exhausted, or like whatever it
Hmm.
may be. There's like a bajillion ways that you could do that. But
Right.
just to recognize that there are some ways that we are able to serve people in the same way, and there
Hmm.
are ways that we can serve people in other ways,
Right.
you know.
Right. Yeah. No, exactly. And that it's seen on a broad scale, like you said, from the literal giving of our bodies, but
Hmm.
also in smaller ways. And I often find that it's in the smaller ways that we are set apart, um,
Yeah.
both from each other as men and women, but also from each other in general. Like because
Hmm.
we all have those unique gifts in that God has blessed us with, and in those gifts is often what we find we need to be giving of.
Yeah.
Um, is we've been given unique talents, and as women especially, like those talents can often be cultivated and flourished in unique ways apart from ways that men's gifts
Yeah.
are cultivated and flourished. So all that to say, like I've often found that in my own, both in my own experience and also in what I've witnessed, is just sometimes what sets us apart in really living out what we're made for as women in relationship and of service is the small things,
Hmm.
um and in giving of ourselves, because often it's those small things that you think go unnoticed, um or you think don't mean much, but then you realize how much of a sacrifice or how much of that gift it actually is.
Hmm.
um and so I think I felt the need to note that, because I think we have this conversation where we're talking in such, big ways about what we're meant to be and who we are meant for, how we are made and what we are made for. But then also like recognizing that in your day to day, like there are so many ways in which this can be lived out.
Yeah.
And service, if it's on the forefront of your mind, can be done in so many ways and make such a difference in glorifying what God has made you to be.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I like, thank you for bringing that back down to like a very practical level, because I
Yeah.
think sometimes we can like talk about these things, and of course we're, we went big so that we can go narrow
Yeah,
at the
exactly.
beginning. And
Yeah.
so sometimes going big can take us out of reality for a second. I mean, it helps us with our perspective, but it takes us out of reality for a second.
Right.
And the
God is big. We
reality,
have to see him in a big way.
right. And the
That
reality
makes
is
sense.
that like, these are like, this is what we're made for, right? But it's also considered an ideal because we live in such a fallen world.
Right.
Right. And that these things that we're saying, instead of being, the majority and like the rule, you could say, have become the exception.
Right.
And that's not, it's not reality in terms of like what we're actually made for, but it is reality in terms of the world that we live in. So like, how do we like reconcile that with, well, where do we go from here? Right? In
It's a big
living in
question.
such a fallen world, I mean, this is the question of
it's the question.
the question. But, how do we reconcile what we're made for, this beauty and this goodness, and, knowing what to do in a sense, but also like
living
really not knowing what to do in a sense.
Right.
And with all the obstacles and other people kind of coming in around us.
Yeah. Well, in a lot of ways, what I tend to try and remind myself to do when I find my own mindset or my mentality kind of shifting away, I find like kind of going back to what we were talking about, where it comes to like rightly ordering our priorities and reminding ourselves of whose we are first, and who made us. So if we want to see it from the context of the relationships that you talked about, those 4 main relationships, if you want to, daily going through the process of rightly ordering, what are we thinking about first and foremost, and then what comes off of that, and that can be made into a practical, like into an actual practice, I guess you could say, in many different ways. But I can see that being something that someone can turn into a tool to help center themselves. And because you're right, so much of where we are fallen in this world has to do with, as a society, forgetting whose we are, what we are made for, and so it's hard to be like, well, if only they just all did this one thing,
I know, right?
We're all gonna be great. But in some ways, it kind of is. It's like if you just if we all imagine what would happen if we all, had a practice of every day, every morning, waking up. Oops, sorry, just lost my headphone. If we all had that practice of rightly ordering our day, rightly ordering our mind, it sounds so like, woo, like it sounds really abstract, but that's why I'm saying I feel like there are many ways that it can be made into a practical, like step-by-step thing. I'm sure it might, who knows, I mean, someone might even have created one, some sort of like activity or some sort of brain practice to like actually help with that. I myself don't necessarily know that, but for me, it's enough just to think, like to remind myself and think about, and particularly in prayer. But like we've said, the world is a fallen place. Like there's even within our faith, there are people who are not living in the way that they should be when it comes to rightly ordering, and reminding themselves of that. And again, that even sounds silly to say out loud, and like, oh, all I gotta do is remind themselves of this, and that's solving their problems. But it's the classic thing of like, is it really that simple? Well, kind of. Like it kind of is that simple. It has to be done on a daily practical level, not just in an abstract way.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think the other thing is that like to recognize that just because other people are doing it or because we've done it in the past, that it doesn't mean that we have to fall short.
Right.
or
Right.
that, you know, because a lot of times it's simply taking the easy way out. And
Totally.
that's
I
what
mean,
it is with like a lot of sin, is taking the easy way out. But it's
totally.
just like knowing like you don't have to give up. You don't have to give
Right.
up your ideal. You don't have to give up, you know, your idea of what you were made for. You
Mm-hmm.
don't have to give up the truth just because no one else is living that way,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or
Mm-hmm.
because it's a lot easier, or because it's a lot harder to live that way,
Mm-hmm. I
right?
mean, God has asked us to,
Mm-hmm.
he told us that living our faith was going to be counter to society, counter
Yes.
to the world. Um, and I think we as a society, even as a faith people, forget that.
Yeah.
Like, it's supposed to be hard. It's
Yeah.
not going to be easy. But sorry, I kind of cut you off. You were finishing your
No, that's
statement.
okay. I mean, yeah, no, it's so true. It's so true.
Yeah.
It's yeah. And just like I just want to leave you with the motivation of like you can do the hard thing. Like I know
Hmm.
that's a very like buzzword thing, like you can do hard
I
things,
know.
but it's like if you look at it from the way of you were created with this in mind for this
Hmm.
purpose. You were created this way. You were given all of the gifts. Like
Hmm.
you have no excuse.
Right. No, I know.
Like
It's a tough
tough
love.
love here, but like
Yeah.
you have no excuse to give up or to give in because
Yeah.
you've been given everything.
Exactly. You've
And
been given all the
maybe
tools.
right, and maybe like you know, you need to work harder to really build up those
Hmm.
relationships because again, like we mentioned, like relationships are a two-way street. And so like maybe it takes a little bit more work from you, but it's
Hmm.
always worth it. Just
Hmm.
as Christ, I can guarantee you would come back to earth just to be crucified again,
Again. Hmm.
you know?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yep.
Mhm.
I feel like I could keep. I'm gonna. I could keep
Well,
going.
anyway, we could talk about this forever. We could talk about any of these topics that, you know,
Like
spin off
every
from
little
this,
nugget that we had could literally become its own episode or like its own
which maybe
conversation.
we'll make happen. So if
Yeah.
you're listening to this and you want to hear something specific, let me know.
Hmm.
And we'll have Sarah come back.
Yes.
And
Well, we were very aware of how, in a way, broad this was, and it was
yes,
intentionally so, knowing
yes.
that you kind of it's setting the groundwork, it's setting the foundational
Mhm.
elements of future conversations and future well, yeah, future conversations.
Yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, and I forgot, but at the beginning I never asked you to like introduce yourself. But you
Oh,
know what? We can like you'll come back and we can
yeah,
do
I'll
that
be
the
back
next
again.
time.
Sure.
So that'll work. Just
You
you
can
can find her
still
on
put my
Instagram.
like yeah, you can still put my Instagram in there if you want. I don't really care. I mean, I
Good.
didn't feel the need to be introduced. I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, um but yeah, but I know we did want to leave at least with this quote too. We did
Yes.
I
So
think
I
we
was
didn't
just gonna ask, like, do you have
yeah.
a quote that you want to leave us with
Yeah.
so that we can chew on?
Yeah. I think the beauty of having natural conversation is that we might have intended to have even more quotes sprinkled throughout, but it's great. I think this is probably better to just end with this. So as we've established that JP2 is definitely our guy. He's our man.
Hmm.
He's the best. Um, and he has some of the most impactful letters and writings of talking about women and their value and their purpose.
Hmm.
Um, we didn't go into this either, but I'm sure we could eventually. But he talks a lot about Mary and the fulfillment of the feminine genius in Mary, and it goes on and on. So it's beautiful.
Hmm.
He if you haven't read his letter to women, please do. That's what this quote is coming from. But here it is. So he says, perhaps more than men, women acknowledge the person because they see persons with their hearts. They see them independently of various ideological or political systems. They see others in their greatness and limitations. They try to go out to them and help them. In this way, the basic plan of the Creator takes flesh in the history of humanity, and there is constantly revealed, in the variety of occasions, that beauty, not merely physical, but above all spiritual, which God bestowed from the very beginning on all, and in a particular way on women. Yeah,
So
pretty.
beautiful.
I feel like
I
you can't
mean, we
say
don't
any
have to
better
say
than
anything
that.
else about that
Yeah,
because,
exactly. Pretty
yes,
much
but
self-explanatory.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. Like
Of
I
course, my
mentioned,
pleasure.
we will have Sarah back. So
Yes.
it's not the last time you hear from her. But yeah, take that quote, chew on it. Like you said, go read the JP2's letter to women. It's
Mhm.
beautiful.
Mhm.
But yeah,
Wonderful.
until next time.
Yay. Bye, everybody.